he used to do with me. Who lead you to learn that freedom's company. Well, good evening. We're going to get started now. If you guys could find your seats, please. So thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Jim Boren, Executive Director of the Institute for Media and Public Trust here at Fresno State, and I also teach journalism at the university. First, a note to thank our sponsors, the President's Office at Fresno State, the Kenneth L. Maddie Institute, the James B. McClatchy Foundation, and the Institute for Media and Public Trust. We are deeply honored that the Media Institute is one of the sponsors of Robert Costa's talk tonight. When we launched the Institute in 2018, we also had the privilege of being one of the sponsors of one of Bob's initial talks at Fresno State, making him a key figure in help establishing the mission of our Institute. As the only institute of its kind in the California State University system, we take pride in showcasing Fresno State's commitment to addressing the pressing issues of our time through innovation, leadership, and collaboration. Since our inception, the Institute has spearheaded several impactful initiatives. We launched the Journalists of Color training program to foster greater diversity in local newsrooms, provided training opportunities for both student and professional journalists, and established ourselves as a statewide leader in media literacy, a vital skill in today's increasingly complex and often uncertain media landscape. Additionally, we just introduced a podcast entitled Exploring the Future of Journalism, broadening the conversation on the evolving issues of media in our society today. Our most recent endeavor is a healthcare reporting fellowship made possible by a $300,000 grant from the California Endowment. This initiative will bring a mid-career journalist to the San Joaquin Valley to focus on the region's unique healthcare challenges. As part of the program, we will also hire a Fresno State journalism student as a research assistant, creating a meaningful, hands-on learning opportunity that serves both the student and our community. As we look forward to hearing from one of the nation's most distinguished journalists, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to Bob for his unwavering support and dedication to Fresno State and to keeping the San Joaquin Valley residents informed about the critical issues of shaping our nation. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce the president of our university, Dr. Saul Jimenez Sandoval. He is the 9th president of Fresno State with deep roots in the Valley, having grown up in Fowler. Please welcome President Jimenez Sandoval.
Thank you, Jim, and it's great to see all of you here today. I'm truly honored to be able to host and to be able to partner with Blake Zante on this. Fresno State takes great pride in being a space for meaningful dialogue, where our community can engage with ideas that shape our understanding of our past, our present, and our future. Tonight's event with Bob Costa not only exemplifies his commitment, but also highlights the Central Valley's critical role in national discussions. I want to sincerely thank Blake Zante, the Executive Director of the Maddie Institute, for putting this event together. The Maddie Institute connects our university and community to important regional, state, and national policy discussions. And now it's my great honor to introduce our distinguished guest, Robert Costa. As a nationally renowned journalist and author, and as the chief election and campaign correspondent for CBS News, Robert Costa has become one of the most trusted voices in American politics. His insightful reporting and unparalleled access to key decision makers have provided millions with a deeper understanding of our political landscape. I truly appreciate Bob's special connection to our valley and his sincere interest in sharing with us his thoughts on the current and future state of politics in our country. And I want to give him 3 gifts, actually 4 gifts. One of them is honey from our valley, produced by our students. The second one is wine, produced here at Fresno State, as well, produced by our students. The third is olive oil. These are meaningful gifts that embed within them the hope for our future. The fourth gift is a tie from Fresno State because he's becoming one of ours. So please welcome Bob Costa. We will ship these to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to make sure I wear this tie on TV soon. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, President. Thank you so much. What a special gift. Thank you so much. I know you're all jealous. I can't wait to wear the Fresno State tie on CBS Sunday morning.
I'll be looking for that, Bob. I'll be looking forward to that.
It's my in-depth investigation of Jim Boren.
Well, great. Well, thank you all for being here this evening. I'm Blake Zanti. I'm the executive director of the Maddie Institute. And Bob, it's great to have you. Thanks for coming to
be here.
Fresno.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It really means a lot. Thank you so much.
Now, I don't think you need any more introduction. I think we can just jump right into the conversation. The question that's on everyone's mind, President Trump, right, is back in the White House. How did
Seems like some people rather forget.
I heard a groan. I maybe heard a cheer. It's a mixed crowd.
It's a bipartisan audience.
Yeah, it is. And that's what we do here at the Maddie Institute. How did we get here? You've been covering President Trump for a very long time. And take us back in history a little bit, maybe when this all started, and then how did we get here in this moment in time?
Well, it's such a pleasure to be back here at Fresno State. Can you all hear me okay? So the first time I ever came to Fresno was my birthday. I remember it well, October 14th, 2017. And I came to Fresno State for a discussion here on politics. And I went to a football game, and then I spoke the next day. The first thing I did is I met the Bulldog. What's the Bulldog's name?
Victor E. Bulldog.
Victor E. Bulldog. Yep. Victor E. Bulldog. Whoever came up with that's clever. I like that. And that was the first year of the Trump administration. And I had interviewed and covered President Trump for a long time, going back to 2010. And in that conversation back in 2017, it was so evident to me as a reporter that Trump was just starting to get used to power. He had been this political outsider. And at the time in that conversation at Fresno State, it was about covering an outsider in Washington. Now, years later, I'm coming here after the 2024 election with a new job, 3 years at CBS. Last time I was here, I was at PBS and the Washington Post. And we see in President-elect Trump someone who's not necessarily an insider, but someone who is fully comfortable with power. And it has come through to me in my reporting in recent weeks. I've interviewed President Biden, Vice President Harris. I've also spoken to President-elect Trump. And I've called him on the phone on Election Day, a few times after the election. And this might alarm some of you, but it may make some of you happy. I've never seen him or heard him calmer. He's what I call Zen Trump, if there is such a thing, because he knows what he wants to do. And he now knows how he wants to staff his government. And so this changes how we think about the Trump presidency, how we think about Donald Trump, the president-elect of the United States, because he is no longer the Washington outsider. He is now nominating people who are disruptors like himself for some of these key positions. And what's so different about this moment in 2024 as we gather here in the Central Valley versus when we gathered here in 2017 is that when I came here in 2017, it was still a time in America where there were many protests going on. You remember the pink hats in Washington and elsewhere. You had a fervor in the anti-Trump movement that has now translated, for now, into political exhaustion. What I've encountered on the campaign trail across the country, but especially in the political battlegrounds, Blake, is that Americans, right, left, and center, are exhausted. And it's not necessarily, I've detected in my reporting, only because of President-elect Trump. For many people, that's part of it. But Jim Boren and I have discussed this. People are tuning out of the news. People are tuning out of politics. And they're exhausted by the global pandemic, which has been a traumatic experience for many people. So traumatic, like most traumas in life, people don't want to talk about it. But it's had a lingering effect on people's lives and how they think about their own political views. And it's led to what I would call this kind of quiet transformation of the American electorate, where many working people in this country who might be traditional Democrats have started on issues like the economy, immigration, and trade to quietly move to the right to Trump, but not necessarily talk about it even with their spouses, their partners, their families, their friends, but they're living on their phones, on social media, consuming different information. And it leads to these new political coalitions where Liz Cheney, the former Wyoming congresswoman, is with Kamala Harris, the vice president, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a former Democrat who supports abortion rights, is now being nominated for Trump's cabinet. And so it's such a historic moment, and it's a different kind of moment. And I think we all feel it, even those who aren't reporters. This isn't 2017. This is a new moment where the Democrats now are trying to figure out what's next, and the Republicans are now fully accepting that Trump is the party, at least for the moment, the next 4 years.
Well, and you talk about the effects on, the San Joaquin Valley. I mean, I think we've certainly seen that shift. Even in some counties just 4 years ago, now have switched over and voted for Trump. Speak to that a little bit. I mean, what are the effects here in the San Joaquin Valley when you're talking about some of these issues? What change does that represent?
I've really had an opportunity, luckily, to get to know members of Congress from the San Joaquin Valley. And I stay in close touch with Congressman Costa, who's here when he's in Washington, to understand what's going on in Fresno and in the Fresno State community. And he's always been such an advocate for Fresno State. I've also gotten to know Republicans from the Valley in depth. On election night 2010, 14 years ago, I was the only reporter who spent election night with Kevin McCarthy when he was rising through the ranks. And to think that he would become Speaker of the House from Bakersfield, California, but especially the Valley, is really now a crossroads of American politics. And you're seeing all of the issues that have been dominant here for years are now rising up to the national conversation. Trade, in a way it really hasn't been for years, is now going to be front and center, with President-elect Trump promising these tariffs across the board. How is that going to affect manufacturing equipment and crops that come from China and the competition farmers face in the Valley? How does Mexico respond to Trump's tariff threats, or his actual tariffs should they come true in 2025? The water issues, economic development issues. California is often maligned in the political press and in Washington as somehow this liberal bastion that's not a part of the national conversation. But if you look at the reality, California has produced 2 recent speakers of the House, a vice president of the United States, a governor who's really at the forefront of the Democratic conversation in Gavin Newsom, a possible presidential contender in both Vice President Harris and Governor Newsom, and maybe even someone like Senator Schiff or Senator Padilla down the line. And you have all these members of Congress who are facing tough races in the Valley. And the tough races in the Valley correlate to tough races you see in the industrial battlegrounds in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And you see in a place like Pennsylvania, where I grew up, so many of the same conversations you're having here in the Valley on water, on trade, on immigration. And they're influencing how Pennsylvania is looking at politicians. And you could see perhaps in the next 5 to 10, 15 years, more unconventional figures, people who are not maybe part of traditional party structures, rising here because the parties are really shaking up who represents. What does it mean to be a Republican? Does it mean you listen to Appleton and you like Devin Nunes? Or does it mean maybe you like Trump, but you also like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and you voted for Jim Costa over the years, but you also voted for some Republicans for city council or for assembly? The politics are scrambled right now. And I really believe maybe you felt 10 years ago like you weren't a big part of the national conversation, but with trade and immigration, such a vital part of the debate, you're going to be front and center. And what I'm really watching as a reporter is, should President-elect Trump, and he has told me in interviews recently, he's going to move forward with what he calls mass deportations. And what does this do to the political makeup of the Central Valley? Obviously, progressives from Fresno and other parts of the Valley will be appalled and will fight that policy. But do business leaders who operate farms in the Central Valley, how do they respond, even if they like President Trump's economic policy. They like his border policy. If undocumented migrants are part of their workforce, how do they actually handle it? Are new coalitions going to develop or not? Does it have an economic effect? Many business leaders I've spoken to here and elsewhere believe that the Trump administration in 2025 are going to focus, the leaders there are going to focus mainly on undocumented migrants who have track records of criminality, and that will be kind of the first layer of the mass deportations. But there's no guarantee about how this is all going to play out. That's more of a sense and a belief, a prediction versus any kind of hard fact. And you have in Trump someone who really believes the immigration and border issue is what put him in the White House again, against all odds. An assassination attempt. I sat 7 weeks behind Trump in a trial in New York. I mean, you think about it, the president-elect of the United States, not that long ago, was convicted in a criminal trial in New York. Now, you might dismiss the trial, or you might say it was serious, but it was a criminal trial, a jury of his peers, and he's now the president-elect. So we're living in this convulsive time where he really believes he's comfortable with power now, and he has this mandate. But the Democrats facing the defeats, we've seen in history that it's only really in defeat do parties begin to reimagine who they are. And this gives an open opportunity now for the Democrats to reconsider post-Biden, maybe post-Harris, maybe she comes back. Is the party going to galvanize working people in particular? I was talking to a lot of reporters in Washington when the firefighters union decided not to endorse Vice President Harris this time around. That was a big tell for a lot of people in the reporting corps that she was going to have trouble beating Trump. Because President Biden got 80 million votes, over 80 million votes in 2020. She did not get anywhere close to that, about 10 million less. Where did those Biden voters go? A lot of those voters I've detected on the trail were union members or members of a union family or worked in agricultural or industrial areas. And they, for whatever reason, didn't show up for the Democrats. And so the real challenge for the Democrats is not just who's going to lead them, but are they able with their message and their policy positions to win over working people who have softened their support for the Democrats?
Let's talk about that a little bit. With the Democratic Party, President Biden, you were one of the only people to interview President Biden in the White House residence. What about his decision to step aside, to not run again for a second term? Tell us a little bit behind that interview that you did and maybe some of the psychology, the strategy that was behind that decision.
It's interesting how that all came together, if you can hear me. So my motto as a reporter is assume nothing, because you never know how things are going to play out. And I made the decision years ago to get to know Trump, to get to know Bernie Sanders. And those decisions paid off in terms of getting to know people who ultimately became major political figures. My interview with President Biden, I'm the only reporter, I don't mean to brag, I'm just telling you the story. I'm the only reporter to ever interview the President of the United States in this last 4 years in the residence of the White House. How does that happen? How does that happen? It's just, to me, it's a story about journalism. In 2018, 2019, Joe Biden was a former vice president of the United States. And in the eyes of most Democrats, he was going nowhere. It was so easy for me as a reporter to cover him. I could interview Biden, I could get to know Biden because other reporters ignored him. They thought he was too old and he wasn't going to be a serious player in 2020. But I covered Biden seriously. I wrote a book with Bob Woodward that focused a lot on President Biden that came out in 2021. And I spent tons of time on Biden, his family, his friends, his advisors, his whole world. And I got to know how the personal side of him influences the tragedy of 1972, his son's struggle with addictions. And so when he wins the nomination out of the blue in 2020, remember, he loses New Hampshire, he loses Iowa. Everybody writes him off. Then Jim Clyburn from South Carolina decides to endorse him, and he suddenly surges to the front of the pack. In 2020, he ultimately wins the Democratic nomination. People always undersold Joe Biden as a political figure inside of his own party, inside the political press. But I covered him and I took him seriously as a political figure, just like I take Trump seriously as a political figure. And I realized in my reporting that Biden never wanted to leave. After the 2022 midterms, he told his advisors, we did better than expected in the midterms. I'm going to stay in. And some advisors and friends said, you're too old, get out, let somebody else come in. But he was dogged and determined because of what happened in 2018, 2019, 2020. He's always been counted out in his view, and he wanted to stay in. And then after June 27th, we all watched the debate on CNN. He has almost every Democratic leader seems to be uneasy, if not pushing him out of the race. And he ultimately decides in mid-July to exit the race. And I said to the White House, I just want to have a conversation with him because this is a moment the country needs to know what happened and why did he do this. And sometimes as a reporter, in a moment of history, I believe it's the job of the reporter to kind of step aside, not to be invisible, but to let the newsmaker make the news. And so if you watch that interview on CBS, I sat down with him in his residence and I asked him, the first question I asked him is, you're there in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware in July of 2024, and you decide against every fiber in your being was to stay in, you decide to get out. Tell me the story. And he said, and he started to name drop Nancy Pelosi. And she noticed, and a lot of people noticed that he name dropped her. And there's a lot of anger still among Biden allies about how this all played out. They felt Speaker Pelosi and others, based on my reporting, were pushing him out in an aggressive way, and that they felt he beat Trump in 20, he could beat Trump again. Of course, there's a real debate among Democrats about whether that's true or not, but that was a firm belief in the Biden camp. And so we're dealing now with the president who just pardoned his son, Hunter, who's on his way out. And the Democratic Party is not ideologically in any way, it seems, inclined to follow the Biden project. But Biden tried, if you look at what he did, even if you don't like him, he tried to couple enormous spending with progressive values, and as well as kind of a Main Street, common sense, everyday Scranton Joe personality. So when Biden comes in 2021, he spends $1 trillion on the American Rescue Plan, over $1 trillion on infrastructure. But what happened in 2024? Did one voter here ever talk about those spending programs? Unlikely. I never heard a voter talk about it. So that's part of the challenge for the Democrats. They did all of this federal spending, but at the end of the day, the only people who seem to remember that federal spending blamed it for inflation and didn't give the Democrats much credit. So Biden leaves with a complicated political portrait for many Democrats, but he's still, in many ways, beloved by Democrats because he beat Trump in 20. But with Trump's return, how history remembers this is still something to be written.
You know, we reviewed sort of how we got here with Trump, how we got here with President Biden. We were talking earlier with a group of students, and we were kind of asking them and talking with them about history, where we're at in this moment in history. Where are we at in this moment in history? I mean, you studied history at Cambridge. Maybe tell us first that story, how you ended up there, but also where are we at in this moment in history? What does this tell us?
Well, I went to Cambridge because I wanted to study Winston Churchill in World War II. And I love the history of World War II. And I just went back to London with my father a couple of weeks ago for a trip and took my father around where Churchill went to the cabinet war rooms in London. You know, I've told this story a few times, but I think about it often about what kind of moment we're in. In 2011, I'm just getting my start in journalism, and I meet an unknown filmmaker from California, from Los Angeles, named Steve Bannon. And Bannon tells me in 2011 that the future of this country is populism and nationalism. And I remember hearing those terms in 2011 and saying to myself, what are those terms? I mean, no one uses those terms. And his argument was the middle class has been destroyed, and these are going to create new dynamics where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have to either become the party of the worker or they go nowhere. And so conceptually, it's hard for all of us to think about what does it mean to be kind of a country that's open to populist and nationalist politics, because this seems like more European style politics. But Trump is a movement political figure. And I think the hardest thing for a lot of reporters and a lot of people in the political world is to recognize and accept that the traditional way we've digested politics is no longer the guidebook or the playbook. And when I'm talking to the students today at Fresno State, it was fascinating to hear their conversations amongst each other. Because if you think about a student who's 21, 22 years old, 19, the last 8, 9 years when Donald Trump has been on the political stage, that is their life.
And I should add too, it was a bipartisan group of students
It
all
was.
across the spectrum.
And they don't see Bernie Sanders, the senator, or President-elect Trump as these kind of outlier figures. These are the figures of their political lives. And so for a baby boomer or a millennial, seeing the rise of a democratic socialist or a nationalist type Republican seems a little bit jarring. It's an outlier. But it's so intriguing how for these students today, this is real. And their interpretation of what's different is very different than your interpretation of mine if you're over 30 or over 40 or 50 or 60 or 70. So that's changing the American political scene.
Let's talk about bipartisanship. It's something the Maddie Institute is very keen on. It's a core part of our mission. Is that something possible? I mean, what's possible in the coming year, the 119th Congress, I believe we're entering into? Is that something that you think is possible? Is it an ideal that the days of Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, are they over? Or is there still opportunity for folks to work together on some key issues? And maybe what are those issues?
It's a great question, Blake. President-elect Trump he's interesting. When I first started talking to him, sometimes with Trump, you go through waves. And I first started talking to him this summer, again, for the first time in a while. And I would call him up on the phone, and he would say, "What do you want?" And then eventually he would start saying to me, "You call this number a lot, don't you?" I said, "Well, I'm just doing my job." And the notable thing was he took the call. He took the call of a guy who talked to him for 2010 through 2021, 2022. He didn't love my book with Bob Woodward. Fine. And it was just reporting. And I didn't take an opinion in the book. But Trump took the call. That doesn't make Trump a saint or a hero, but it's telling about the kind of person he is. That whether it's the press or with Democrats, he's willing to take the call and have a conversation. Look at what he just did last week. He promised even heftier tariffs on Canada, and Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, decided to fly down to Mar-a-Lago and have dinner with him because he knows that the personal relationship with Trump is important because Trump's all about the deal. And that's what makes Trump different than Bannon. Bannon is someone who's an ideologue. Bannon wants the world to be nationalist, to have American nationalism, this idea of America alone, America first. That's the piston of Bannon's thinking. And I talk to Bannon frequently as a reporter. Trump, when I asked Trump one time, "Are you a nationalist?" He said, "Heck no." And he said, "Stop asking me these questions." He said, "I'm common sense." I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He said, "I just trust my gut. I'm common sense." And that's how Trump perceives things. The deal, the transaction, and things are always possible with Trump to change, to invite new people to the table. And so bipartisanship is very possible in 2025 to a point. Now, if Trump goes very hard on deportations, it could put at risk any ability of Democrats to put political capital on the line and cut a deal with Trump. But there's a lot of opportunity for Democrats and Republicans to work together. What's the biggest legislative thing to pay attention to in 2025? Taxes. The Trump tax cuts expire next year from 2017. Democrats and Republicans want to get credit for lowering tax rates and for having carve-outs for different groups, maybe for different groups here in the Valley. And they're going to work together on tax reform, and that's long been an area of bipartisanship. And you could ultimately see a real bipartisan package on taxes because there's a lot of incentive for both parties to have their fingerprints on tax reform. The other issue is trade. When I first started covering Congress 15, 17 years ago, Democrats were the protectionists. Democrats were the party that talked about tariffs. They don't love in Congress, the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats, that Trump's suddenly Mr. Protectionist. They want to be seen as pro-tariff. And so you're looking now at a Democratic Party that might want to work with Trump on some of these trade deals.
Let's go back to sort of what we started talking about when you said that the Democratic Party, this is an opportunity for it to really define itself, to find who that next leader is going to be. A lot of folks are counting Vice President Harris out. She just ran, she lost this campaign. But if we look to history, we see, folks like Richard Nixon, who came back and won.
Is Blake trying to jinx her campaign?
But the point is that it's possible. No, we're nonpartisan. But California is an influential state, and let's look at who those contenders are. Vice President Harris, Governor Newsom, potentially, who you've spent a lot of time with. Where do you see them ending up in 2026 and 2028?
Vice President Harris.
You might be jinxing their campaign.
No. Vice President Harris has a big decision to make. Is she going to come back to California and run for governor? And based on my reporting, she's having conversations with allies who are encouraging her to come back. This frustrates many California Democrats who have been waiting years to run for governor. And now they all have to wait on her decision. But hey, that's politics. Politics is rough business. And they're all going to wait to see if this major presence in Vice President Harris comes back. Now, we were joking, in 1962, Pat Brown beats Richard Nixon. In that famous press conference in 1962, Richard Nixon famously or infamously said, "You're not going to have Nixon to kick around anymore." So Harris knows about that history. It's not easy to come back and just expect the country and the state to embrace you again. It's possible. She'll probably be the nominee, but if she runs, but no guarantee. Somebody might say, I don't want to let my opportunity go. I'm going to challenge her in the primary and run against her on some issues. So I don't think it's a guaranteed nomination for her if she chooses to run. Newsom's someone to really watch because I was with him at length. It's crazy how this all played out. I spent a lot of time with Governor Newsom in June and early July. I was doing a major profile of him for CBS and going to spend time with him at different places. I spent time with him in New Hampshire, and I asked him about his support for President Biden because he was out there for President Biden all the time. President Biden's the best. People kind of forget this. He was the biggest cheerleader for President Biden when President Biden was getting knocked around by Democrats for that debate performance.
In New Hampshire, just a casual place to
right.
go.
I was with Gavin Newsom in New Hampshire at a rest stop in New Hampshire. Now, you don't end up at a rest stop in New Hampshire talking to CBS unless you have your eye on the White House. I think. It's a good place to take vacation, but I mean, there's a very small beach in New Hampshire. I would think Governor Newsom would spend more time in California. My siblings, they got a kick out of the clip we sent out of this interview because I said, and my friends in DC, I asked Governor Newsom, this is in late June, is there any daylight between you and President Biden? And he goes, Bob, no daylight, no daylight.
You've been working on that, haven't you?
So whenever I'm in meetings now at CBS or with friends out in Washington, I'll say like, do you agree with that person? People will go to me, no daylight. And Newsom is interesting because that profile got killed, never aired. Shows you journalism could be strange. That profile was supposed to air on July 14th, 2024. What happens the day before Trump's assassination attempt? So I was on TV for 15 hours, special report, Trump's almost killed in Pennsylvania. And we're sitting there at CBS with this 10-minute profile of Gavin Newsom, but it makes no sense to put that on television because it's all old news talking about politics before the assassination attempt. We had finished a 10-minute package on Newsom. All this time and effort I put into this Newsom thing just killed. But Newsom understood because it would have been weird to air that the day after the assassination attempt. It wouldn't, in that news moment, it would have been strange. But Newsom's such an intriguing figure. You might not like him, you might love him, but I think he's interesting because he was ready to run in 2024 should Biden drop out and it was an open convention or open primary. He was with Biden as close as you could be, no daylight. But he was ready in case that changed. And then it changed in an instant on July 21st. But within 2 hours, Biden endorses Harris. And what does Newsom do? He quickly gets behind Harris, and he's there for her at the convention. What I expect to see from Governor Newsom in the coming 2 years is a big emphasis on 2026 and to help Democrats win back the House and win back the Senate. And I think Newsom deserves objectively some new attention because he has spent a lot of time, and I've talked to him about this, studying the right. He did a debate with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He watches Sean Hannity to the chagrin of his family. He watches Fox News all the time because he's studying the conservatives. And Newsom recognizes something's happening in this country where a lot of young people and older people are watching podcasts, listening to alternative media. And if Democratic leaders aren't familiar with the new cadence, the new language of the right, they're going to be left out. Now, that's not to say Newsom's going to be the nominee in 2028. He's going to face a ton of competition. Governors like Whitmer in Michigan, Westmore in Maryland, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, many senators from Cory Booker to Amy Klobuchar to others, Pete Buttigieg. The list is going to be long of likely contenders, but Newsom is trying to position himself as somebody who's not just the former San Francisco mayor, not just the governor of California, but someone who's a leader in thinking through how Democrats can rebuild the party. And I think he's going to do a lot between now and 2026 to make a case to the country and to the Democrats that he's ready to build a broader coalition. We'll see, though. As we've seen in Newsom's career, sometimes he's very effective and sometimes he's not.
A couple more questions before, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. Here in the Valley, this is a battleground area, as you mentioned earlier. At this very moment, they are counting ballots for Congressional District 13, a very contested race. They're only separated by 200 odd votes every time an update comes out, more or less. What's your take on that? I mean, can you talk a little bit about the local impact here of how the Central Valley is so integral to, who controls the House of Representatives?
It's so integral because regardless of who wins this race, and has it been finalized?
It has
yet?
not been finalized yet, no.
So regardless of who wins, the narrow margins in Congress really influence how the House of Representatives run. And I've spoken with Congressman Costa and others about this, Republicans and Democrats. When you have a narrow majority in the House, it makes it very difficult for the House to function. It enables people like Congressman Matt Gaetz, who was briefly nominated for Attorney General, to upend the entire House of Representatives. And when I first started covering Congress, the speakers of the House wielded enormous power. But in a narrow House, the speaker of this time, Mike Johnson, he can only do so much because these people have such high profiles on their own, social media, conservative talk radio, conservative television for liberals. It's about advocacy groups, social media presence. AOC has millions of followers online. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. So it's hard for the leadership to hold the members in line. But it's good for the Valley in the sense that regardless of who wins this race, you see tight races across the Valley. So in 2026, you're going to see more national attention to the Valley. It's going to bring more eyeballs to the Valley. And I think you can already see Governor Newsom's coming to Fresno. He's coming to the Valley more because you have to pay attention to the Valley because California, people act now like it's this entrenched blue state that will never change. But if you talk to the Garvey campaign and others, they actually feel pretty good about where they did in parts of California. And it wasn't that long ago that Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan were elected presidents of the United States as California Republicans. That's not to say California is going to lurch right, but this expectation that California is a blue state, deep blue forever, is not necessarily a guarantee. And you talk to Governor Newsom and others, they're concerned about issues like people moving out of the state. And I know Fresno State wants to keep the great graduates here in the Valley. But to keep people in the Valley, it's got to be a state where people feel that there's economic opportunity and that they can build a family and a community here. And so we're going to see the Central Valley on not just a congressional race level, but also a governmental regulation level, really become a central focal point. People laugh on the left at Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy starting this DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. It's really an outside group, non-federal group that's going to make recommendations to the federal government about cutting bureaucracy. But I've already heard they're looking at California as a place they want to come because they want to make sure the EPA is enabling businesses on a federal level to grow in California. And they want the fight with Newsom. They want the fight in California because to the Doge crowd, the Elon Musk crowd, California, and a fight with Gavin Newsom, who says, the governor says he wants to, quote, Trump-proof California. Well, for the combative Trump people, that makes California a place they want to come and have that fight. So the Valley, whether you like it or not, is not going to be able to escape the spotlight. You're in the spotlight.
Well, in some degree, I mean, regardless of your political views, that's good for the region. It elevates the issues that are going on here, and sort of symbolic that we're here at Fresno State, surrounded by agriculture on all sides of the campus. We have, students who are undocumented. These are real issues that impact the campus as well. So I guess, in some respects, it does really help the standing of the Valley to elevate those issues and be such a contentious region politically. Let's move on to you. Let's talk a little bit about you and your lessons learned in journalism. We talked about alternative media, and you've also been with a number of different groups, whether it's television or print media. What are your lessons learned throughout your career in journalism? And maybe share a little bit about that with the audience.
Sure. So my career has been interesting. It's been non-traditional in terms of my trajectory in journalism. I think the biggest lesson I've learned, Blake, is to respect the audience, to respect the viewer, and to respect the reader. The mistake so many journalists make is to, in a sense, think that the audience needs to be fed vegetables. I have a belief that people are marinating in the news and in the issues of the day in their own ways on social media all the time. And as a journalist, it's your job to bring them credible, good, fresh information that's of value to their life and is not just some kind of informational list of things that they already know. How do you provide value? And to have an expectation that the audience is able to digest different kinds of stories and different kinds of perspectives. I began my career at a conservative magazine called National Review. And I got that job because it was the only job that was available. No, it's true. I was at the University of Cambridge studying Churchill, and I was applying to ABC, CBS, NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. They all said no because I was over in England as a grad student. I had no money. And I said to all these journalism places, I said, well, my name's Robert Costa. I'm 22, 23. I'm at Cambridge. They said, oh, we'd like to interview you. Can you be here at 9 a.m. on Tuesday? I said, sure. Can you buy me a plane ticket? They said, are you kidding? This is a glorified internship, son. And I said, okay. The only person that would offer me a job over the phone is this magazine, National Review. And I said to National Review in 2009, I said, I'll take this job. It's a great job for first starting off my career. $50,000 seemed like enormous money for me at the time. I'm taking this job. I said, can I just not be a conservative though? They said, you're working for a conservative magazine. I said, I know, but can I just take the job and be a reporter? And I thought it was the worst opportunity in a way because I saw all these people getting fancy jobs at fancy places. And I was at a small magazine and I was covering stuff that wasn't in the mainstream. Sal Russo's here, the longtime political activist. I covered the Tea Party movement when it was starting. I got to know Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, all these people when they were seemingly nobodies. And I spent 5 years at National Review. I ultimately rose to become their Washington editor, ran a staff in my late 20s. And I thought journalism was a business of insiders. And I never thought I'd get a shot at what I would call traditional media. And I would get frustrated in my 20s. And I talked to the students about this today. It's very easy in your 20s to think your career is stalled, that you're going nowhere. But I worked hard. And in 2013, the government shut down. And I knew all of these House Republicans who were controlling the entire debate, and nobody else in the media seemed to know how to reach any of these guys because they were the backbenchers. And then the backbenchers were suddenly calling the shots. And I was the only one who knew the backbenchers at all because the mainstream press were just covering the big names. And so out of the blue, the Washington Post recruits me in 2013 to be one of their top political reporters. It's one of the only times in the Washington Post history they've ever recruited a reporter from a magazine that was a small opinion magazine. But they looked through every one of my articles and they never saw one iota of opinion. And they said, how do you not have opinion? I said, that was my choice. I just wanted to be a reporter. And long story short, that led to me getting a job at PBS. That led to me getting to know Bob Woodward and writing the book. That led to me getting a job at CBS. And it's been a journey for me to see all of these institutions from the inside, MSNBC, PBS, the Washington Post, CNBC, I worked there, National Review, all these places I've been inside the newsroom, inside the decision rooms. And the biggest thing I just have taken away from being at these places, these top places, is that the number one quality I look for in a journalist beyond hard work is humility. Does a journalist have humility to see the story and to accept that the story they envision might not be the story? That you might think Donald Trump is whatever, but he could also still be president of the United States. You might think Gavin Newsom's terrible, but he still could be the next president of the United States. You might think Vice President Harris is finished. Well, that's an assumption. People thought Nixon was finished in 62. After losing to Pat Brown, he wins in 68 and 72. So do journalists have an ability to respect their audiences and to have humility? And I've talked to Jim Boren about this. I'm an optimist, Blake, about the press. Because as much as the traditional news organs are fading away because of the loss of revenue going to tech companies and social media, at the end of the day, if we're all living on our phones, we still need information. And that's why I'm so glad the Maddie Institute is focused on civic participation, getting younger people engaged and organized. And I'm heartened by meeting with Fresno State students that young people want to read, they want to be literate about the news, they're just doing it in a different way. And that if a 21-year-old's not reading a newspaper, doesn't mean they're not reading, but we got to give younger people credit for trying to get things to learn in their own ways.
That's a great point to end on, and maybe we'll now open it up for questions from the audience. If you want to line up at the microphones and come up, we'll open it up for questions. And then we'll just alternate one by one.
Hello, my name is Alex Walker. Thank you for being here, Mr. Costa. You spoke about fatigue experienced by the audience consuming media, and Trump is an unconventional candidate who changed the status quo and playbook of Americans' imagination, expectations of how politics should be or has always been. Yet people at home are fatigued checking out or even consuming different types of media. So my question for you is, from your experiences as a journalist, what needs to change about reporting and how we cover politics that will both engage the audience yet reveal meaningful stories going forward?
It's a great question. We do see the emergence of podcasts and longer form conversation being a part of how people look at the news. I think news organizations are going to need to do a better job of providing quality, long form, in-depth conversations to people. I'm glad the Maddie Institute, I taped an episode with Blake earlier today, is trying to have a longer conversation on public access TV. But I think for journalists here in the Valley, can you go deep on the history of water? I spent some time at the Matsumoto farm after I came here and got to see the peach trees from over 60 years ago and to see the canals that were built around 1916, 1917. Is there obviously regional history here, but is there a podcast? And maybe there is, and I apologize if I'm not fully familiar with all the Valley media. But I think people, as much as they want instant information about the news of the day, they want foundational information, conversations about history, context, so they're better informed. I find people are craving information they find credible and is not trying to be opinionated to the point of lecturing, but people want to learn. You look at YouTube, the amount of millions of views on so many things about learning. People want to learn. And so I think the press needs to meet people there in providing longer form content that's nonpartisan or at least interesting, that gets at the issues at a foundational level instead of just saying, here's what happened today.
And we do have, I can add and chime in there, we do have some local media outlets that are doing that. They're starting to have that long form. I think KVPR, GV Wire as well, Fresno Land, I think, Jim Boren just started his. So there are a lot of different media outlets that are sort of providing that long form conversation about these different issues. And I think there are a lot of folks who tune in.
And when I was in college, I interned at the Charlie Rose Show on PBS. And I eventually became a guest host for Charlie early in my career. And that led me to become the host of Washington Week on PBS. And, that kind of put aside Charlie Rose's issues, which he had to leave the show. That kind of conversation is so powerful. I mean, even the conversation we're having here, and I had a conversation with some of you at the reception earlier, and hope to have this conversation with some of you after, is so important because in a time when, here's what I'm scared about for the country, is even 15 years ago when I was starting out, I would go to someone in a Starbucks or a coffee shop and ask them about their vote, and people would engage with me as a reporter. Now, when I approach so many people in the line of my work, they immediately do this. It's either get out of my face or I don't want to talk, because they think there's a social stigma in getting their political views on the record. There's no interest in even having a political conversation with a reporter. And I get it. There's a cost in many people's views to even having a conversation about politics. But people aren't going to start conversing unless the media and other stakeholders are having those kind of conversations. I think people got to be brought to the table. I've spoken to the Trump campaign about this and President Biden and his people and Vice President Harris. So many people in this country don't feel like they have a seat at the table, whatever that means. Maybe it's in the community, maybe it's nationally. They don't feel like they have a seat at the table. And that to me is such a different kind of debate than right versus left, red versus blue. It's really then about people who feel like they're outsiders in their own community or country and people who are perceived as insiders. And that, to me, the answer to how to fix that dynamic, which is an unhealthy dynamic. If you wake up every day and you feel like you're an outsider in your community or country, you're going to be angry. You're not going to want to participate in the same way. You're not going to have goodwill maybe towards your neighbors or the local community. And that's not an American way of functioning. But the media and the political leadership has to do a better job of making people feel like they have a seat at the table. And that inclusion goes across racial lines, gender lines, and political lines. Do you have a seat at the table? And I don't have an easy answer for that, but it's going to be important in the coming years.
My name is Oscar Spees. I retired from Valley PBS, and we've met. I shot a promo with you when you were here.
Yes,
in 2017.
that's right.
Okay. I only have one word: gerrymandering.
Well, gerrymandering, it happens after the census. Every 10 years, they redraw the congressional districts. Now, many people in the Valley would say there's not a lot of gerrymandering here, to the point where the races are very close. So you could see them after the next census. They're maybe going to try to carve out more districts. The point about gerrymander is a fair one. In many parts of this country, you have very blue districts and very red districts. And this leads to a focus on primary victories versus consensus politics. If you're only worried about being primaried because your district has been gerrymandered to be very conservative or very liberal, then your interest in bipartisanship might be minimal, because you see very little political gain if you take the risk of reaching across the aisle. And so gerrymandering does have a real effect, but it takes political leadership to avoid gerrymandering. So many people who are in constant political leadership, they ultimately want to gerrymander so they can protect their own seats. And so sometimes you've seen a lot of states now, they're moving towards nonpartisan boards to reconfigure the congressional map, to have it less of an inside deal. And so we'll see if that's effective in different states. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I have two questions. First First question: how do you protect your sources with your collaboration with Woodward? And are you familiar with the ongoing case, or I'm not sure if it's settled. It's been, I think it's a stay on it. I'm not sure, but that one journalist that was almost going to go to jail to protect their sources. With the information you get for these books, I'm sure there's some really confidential behind the scenes. Can you speak about how you protect those sources and managing that delicate dance of I have sources, but it's off the record, on the record. Second question is, in the political world, there's a lot of agenda being set by the political daily playbook, and that just kind of gets spread out. And in the political journalism world, like the political playbook runs the daily conversation. Do you ever think that? What's your opinion on that? Do you think that's too much of value stake in the political
Sure.
lexicon with the district? Or
Good
thank
questions.
you. Thank
Good
you.
questions. Thank you. Well, on the sourcing question, very briefly, sourcing has a range of different classifications, and it's not a science, it's an art. On the record means if you're speaking to me, I can quote you and attribute it to your name. That's on the record. If I use something on background, that means if I spoke to a Fresno State professor, but they didn't want to be quoted by name, I would have an agreement with them about how to classify them on background. And sometimes they would say, I'd want to be an academic official. So according to an academic official at Fresno State, the Maddie Institute is great. And I would say to them, well, why don't you put that on the record? That's not a risky thing to say.
I would like that. Let's put it on the record.
Now, sometimes a source will say to me, this is on background. This is on background. I said, okay, put it on the record, because on background should only be granted if there's risk to the source, not to protect the source just because. And this, you have to be careful with this as a reporter. Let's say I'm covering a dispute between two farmers, and one of the farmers is highly critical of the other and says this farmer is a fraud and cheats on their taxes on background. I said, I can't quote that on background. If you're going to make a defaming statement, you better say it on the record, or I'm not going to quote it, because I have liability to just put blind quotes out there into the public sphere that are critical and unverified as a reporter. So you're constantly making judgment calls about background. And sometimes people will say, I don't want to be quoted as an academic official. I just want to be quoted on background as a person. I said, I can't do that. A person. Now, if you were giving me the classified information, which is very risky and borderline illegal, we could have a discussion about classification of sourcing. Deep background is a different classification. Deep background means I'm going to use the information you provide, but I will in no way disclose how I learned about it. So for example, when I was writing the book with Bob Woodward, I found a very sensitive transcript between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Speaker of the House about President Trump's conduct, a private calls transcript, which is unusual to find. And it was not meant to be disclosed in any way. The way we acquired that was sensitive, and we acquired it on deep background, which means you don't in any way suggest to the reader how you acquired it to protect the anonymity of the person who provided it. And we verified it in other ways. Now, I don't love doing that because the reader has to then trust, or the audience has to trust the journalist implicitly that we're providing them credible information. So it really puts you out on a limb as a reporter. You better know what you're doing if you're going to report on deep background, because you're asking the audience to trust you, the reader to trust you. And luckily that transcript was verified not only by us on our own, but through congressional testimony later. It was verified by multiple people testifying before Congress. So, and off the record means if you tell it to me, I can't use it in any way. So off the record, deep background, background on the record. again, you're always kind of navigating. A lot of people, if I'm talking to a senator or a House member, they'll say to me, "Hey, Bob, off the record, this is happening today." I said, "Well, that's not useful to me because technically off the record means I can't use it at all. Can I bring that onto background at least or on the record?" And so it's a tough business because at the end of the day, you would prefer everything to be on the record, but that's just not always possible because of people's professional risk, and they don't want to take it by putting their name on the record. And to the other point briefly, he referenced this publication called Politico Playbook, which every day publishes an insider guide to Washington. Look, I'm a believer that let many flowers bloom. Politico's success and playbook are valuable to people who want to follow the details of Washington. Does that mean you should only read Politico? Probably not. You want to read all kinds of outlets, but I'm not anti-playbook. If people really are into it, let people read it.
Good evening. My name is Christopher Washington, and I'm a law pathway student at our sister school, Fresno City College. And I just want to say thank you for coming to Valley. I watch you on Face the Nation every Sunday.
Thank you.
You and Margaret. And I have a comment and then a question. My comment is I would like to hopefully take a picture with you because you're amazing. And then my substantive question for you is, in Trump's last State of the Union, he made mention of incarceration reform and that things needed to change within this sphere. So based on your conversations with him, is there any daylight in that area?
Oh, the criminal justice reform package was highly controversial inside of Trump's White House when he passed it during his first term. There was fear among some of Trump's conservative allies that it could make him vulnerable in a future primary from the right. But he obviously won the Republican primary easily in 2024. And the issue of incarceration from a conservative perspective never factored into Trump's campaign in any real way. Moving forward, the people who push for criminal justice reform inside the administration are not going to likely be part of the White House. Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and his daughter Ivanka Trump, who was a senior advisor, are not expected to join the administration at this point. You do see in Trump, though, a willingness to pardon many people. And now with the pardon of Hunter Biden, you could see the idea of pardoning and commuting sentencing, whether it's for those who know Trump or not, become a bigger part of the conversation. And there is a belief among many Republicans that some of the reason they've been able to make gains with working Americans, including working Americans of color, is because the Republican Party has been seen as a different party than it was on crime 20 years ago. You look at how Republicans now articulate their position on marijuana, or those who have been in prison for marijuana offenses. There's a push across the board to have people who have criminal backgrounds to now be allowed to work in state governments in different states, to have an ability to have an easier time to come back into the workforce. I actually think, to Blake's point earlier, dealing with criminal justice and related issues is going to be an area of bipartisanship, because as more states legalize cannabis use, marijuana, and move towards sentencing reform, you're going to see perhaps a bipartisan consensus to rethink some of the old federal guidelines on some of these things and who's allowed to vote, who's allowed to come back into the workforce in different capacities. And so Trump has always been an unusual figure. He's anti-crime and he's very pro-police. He's aligned with the police unions, but at the same time, he did do criminal justice reform. And, they say why did Nixon go to China? It's because Nixon had developed so many anti-communist bona fides in the House of Representatives when he was from California. He was able to be this anti-communist. Trump is seen as so locked with the police and the police unions that he has ability in terms of his political positioning to actually still work on sentencing reform.
Hi, my name is Dylan. I am a political science student here at Fresno State, and my question is about the future of the Democratic Party. I see more of a populist shift in the right with Donald Trump. Do you see, whether it be ground game with individual voters or with politicians, a left-wing shift to populism, or a want for a left-wing shift to populism?
So there's a lot of fear in the Democratic Party that they don't have an answer to the populism on the right. But I just offer you 2 cents of my reporting observation. What's the biggest issue in this country in the next 20 years? Any guess? The issue I encounter more than any other issue in my reporting, might surprise you, might not, is aging. Aging. That the baby boom generation, if they're retiring in their 60s, 70s, 80s, might not have the financial solvency and stability to live into their 90s and 100s due to medical enhancements in the development of different pharmaceutical drugs. It's going to extend and enhance human life, which also extends and enhances the burden of financing an elderly population. And there haven't been frank conversations in this country about how are we going to keep Social Security and Medicare funded in a way that's going to enable people to survive as inflation perhaps changes, as the global economy changes. And so part of my answer to you is, when we think about the future, people think the Democratic Party is going through this terrible crossroads because they don't really know where to go. But the state as an idea might rear its head and really come back as an idea. Bernie Sanders is maligned by some people as an outsider still. When I first started getting to know Bernie Sanders in 2014, when he talked about Medicare for all, people thought he was crazy. Now most Democrats embrace Medicare for all. And the future of the Democratic Party is seen as providing Medicare at a wholesale level to most Americans. When Andrew Yang, you might remember him, ran for president in 2020, what did he run on? Universal basic income. It was seen as crazy by some people. But as AI and automation and aging become some of the driving issues of our time, we might see the Republicans and their nationalism be countered not by a Democratic Party that's moving in a more so-called centrist direction or whatever direction, but a Democratic Party that's going to argue for an expanded state to respond to the challenges of the time. More state housing for elderly people, more state federal coverage of healthcare, more maybe universal basic income or something like it to deal with the loss of jobs and the rise of automation and AI. And so we're in this moment where I almost feel like we're having a conversation in 1992 about the internet. And people go, oh, the internet, it's probably going to change things. And we're in that kind of moment now with AI and automation. And we think, oh, the Democratic Party's just got to figure out how it's going to handle a few issues. And look, the Republican Party is so enthralled to Trump, but is the Republican Party ready for what's coming? Is the Republican Party, maybe they cut taxes now on corporate rates and individual rates in 2025, but is the government going to have the revenue it needs 10 years down the road to fund all of these programs it needs to keep people alive and housed in the future? Because the politics, and I've talked to members of Congress about this, politicians now aren't focused on what are we going to do in 2036, 2037, when some of these long-term federal spending programs really start to face financial difficulties and baby boomers are actually healthier than ever and in their 80s and going to live for another 20 years. And the economy is not growing perhaps at the pace it needs to. And so these are serious issues. And that's why, as much as we're fixated on Trump, understandably, 4 more years of Trump, oh my gosh, or great, depending on who you ask, Trump, he's kind of a sign of what's to come potentially, not in terms of nationalism, but in terms of total upheaval. Because these are seismic issues potentially facing us. The rise of China, what does China do with Taiwan? Unrest in Western and Eastern Europe for the first time since World War II, automation, aging, healthcare. Where do all these issues go? I don't know, you don't know. Housing. And you think about all that. Since the last time I was here in Fresno, in Clovis in 2019, so much housing's changed around here. And you have people moving here, which is great. But you also have housing challenges, housing issues, deals with regulations. So it's going to be something to watch.
Hi, I'm Sebastian. Thanks for being here. I had a two-part question. One is on the use of the pardon. It was a pretty significant reversal from what the White House had said on the record. Biden had said that he was not going to interfere with the process and then ultimately decided to pardon his son. Do you think that's going to open the door for President Trump to use his pardon in new ways? Maybe January 6 people or something else, but do you think it's also going to set like a long-term precedent for the future use of pardons? And the second question is, you alluded to several, new forms of media like Rogan, podcasts, all that stuff. Do you think that there's going to be a right sizing in the media, or do you think that there's going to be more of an adaptation where CBS, CNN, they put their own podcasts out and kind of try to adapt to the new format?
Well, on the media question, quickly, I think you're going to see possible consolidation in the industry to survive. And the challenge for the television networks is to continue to grow the audience on streaming as well as on linear television, and to grow digitally as well. You're going to see potentially more nonprofit journalism rise as the lack of revenue from commercial-driven journalism wanes. People are going to try to figure out, how do you cover a community, a state capital, if you don't have a ton of revenue coming in? It could lead to more citizen journalism and how that's all accumulated. So we're in a totally fluid moment for the media. When it comes to the pardon, President Biden, you outlined it. He said he would not pardon Hunter, and he just obviously pardoned Hunter. I would just say this about President Biden. When I went to interview him in August 7th, and I went to his private office upstairs in his house, the whole room is pictures of his sons and his daughters and his family. Like most people in their office, doesn't make him different. You see pictures of his late son, Bo, you see pictures of his son, Hunter, who he calls Hunt. And he takes things very personally. His whole political career is kind of embedded in his own personal story, going back to 72, his ups and downs. I mean, Biden and Trump have more similarities than people like to acknowledge, in the sense that they both endure political pain and personal pain, but especially political pain. I always say the biggest test of someone when I cover them in politics is their tolerance for political pain. How much can they actually take? Biden has his family, members of his family, except his two sons killed in 72. He struggles at times in the 70s and 80s in the Senate, runs and fails for the presidency in 87, 88. The plagiarism scandal, runs and fails for the presidency in 2007. Then he becomes vice president. His son deals with addiction. To pardon Biden, if you've covered Biden, it's not surprising to see this president with this method of leadership and this kind of personal story end up on that decision. Whether it changes Trump, I don't want to get ahead of the president-elect. He has promised to pardon people who have been prosecuted on January 6 related crimes. And Trump has shown, as we were discussing, an openness to sentencing reform. And it's going to raise questions about, look, he's already promising to overhaul the Justice Department. You have a nominee in Pam Bondi who has raised real concerns about how the Justice Department is run. She's the former Attorney General of Florida. And the nominee for the FBI, Kash Patel, has been a severe critic of the FBI. So they're going to have pressure points, no doubt about it, whether it's the pardon or other things.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's McKean Miller. I'm also a student here at Fresno State, also a history major. And my question for you, Mr. Costa, is for students like me, how do you want them to be more engaged with politics, not just here in Fresno, we're in the Valley, but all over the country? How to be more incitative with politics, and how to be more knowledgeable about them?
Well, I think you are knowledgeable. I think for so many Fresno State students I've met here, and I've also stayed in touch with Fresno State students when they come to Washington from time to time, and Blake had a great visit at CVS recently, and we've had others there. You have to be willing, as a Fresno State student, a Fresno State leader, to take a shot. Maybe that's a job, an internship application, to really put yourself forward as someone who wants to be engaged with the national conversation. Because people are impressed by Fresno State students, but you have to be willing to apply and to try to be part of that national conversation. And I think the biggest thing you could do is to read. Now that sounds almost simplistic, but I don't mean it to be. Read the news 30 minutes a day. We all spend too much time on social media. We're all wasting time. I'm as susceptible to waste time as anybody. But the more you can read a book or read about the news in a serious way and inform yourself, then you'll come across as more informed in conversations, and you'll represent Fresno State, yourself, and the community with honor and with real intellectual capability, because you've just done the work to be informed about our times. But I think the biggest thing is people want to see Fresno State students do well and succeed, and run for office or volunteer in your community. Be a part of it. I mean, all these student leaders I met today and I've met before, Fresno State students are not passive people. And you just got to get out there and recognize that you have a voice and you should participate as much as possible. And it takes courage. But you had courage to ask a question, so thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Costa.
Hi, my name is Dee, and thank you for coming. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall when you were talking with the students. It's encouraging that Trump takes your calls, but I remember the press conferences when he was in office before. I've still watched some of those rallies where he still talks about the fake news and how awful all the mainstream media is. So I know there's some real challenges out there, and that's one of the problems I see, is that I'm old enough to remember what it was like before the fairness doctrine went away and the commercialization and ratings. I worry about where people are getting their news, where we can get good news. I worry about millionaires and billionaires buying media sources. GV Wire is owned by an individual that has influences here. How do we combat that? Also, I remember when seeing was believing. And yet I saw a fake video with Jake Tapper recently. It looked like a legitimate news story. It wasn't. And how do you, as a journalist, combat that? And how do people get that? I just see everything as being so polarized. Twitter has become totally different than it was, 5 years ago. So I'd like you to address some of those issues. And then, do you think the media here in this country has done a good job of reporting what's going on over in the Middle East, Palestine, and Gaza? And do you think that had any impact on the 10 million fewer votes?
A lot of questions there.
I know.
Where do you want to start, Bob?
Well, I think the question about the media, so many people talk about the media. The lights in this room are regulated. They're utility. Electricity is a utility. The media is not a public utility. Now, you could have a conversation in this country that maybe news at some level should be. I'm not making that case at all. But news is a private enterprise. And so what do private enterprises need to survive? They need money to hire staff to report the news. So if you want news, you're often going to have to pay for it. The problem is most people have a history of believing they don't need to pay much for it because the news used to be very cheap because they were making their money from advertisements. So you would just pay $1 for the paper, 50 cents for the paper. It was a nothing expense. But with the decline of the collapse of revenue, news is becoming more expensive. And so people aren't acclimated to paying $15 a month or $20 a month for a subscription to a news service. It's not part of the way people live. But that's now the reality of how the news is often being sent out. It's a newsletter you sign up for and you potentially pay for. And that's a challenge because people aren't used to doing that and including that as part of their expenses. But we are seeing the decline sometimes when people get rid of cable news. They're moving maybe more towards online news, web news, video news, and they're willing to pay for it to a point. The point about AI, AI is changing video, and news literacy is a key thing in this country. I know local groups here work on news literacy a lot. I've worked with a group called the News Literacy Project, a nonpartisan group in Washington to try to help educate high school and college students about just the different outlets and availability there is to learn about different news sources. But it's not easy because young people aren't being, if your parents don't even read the news or watch the news, you can't have an expectation the child somehow going to have news literacy in the traditional sense. But that's okay. Instead of being negative and sour about that, you got to adapt and provide people with new information. In terms of the issue in the Middle East, Israel's war with Hamas and what's going on in Gaza, is it the reason Vice President Harris did not get President Biden's 81 million votes? Hard to say, because as I was discussing earlier, the lack of support from some labor coalitions for Vice President Harris was also a part of the conversation. Did some young people turn off to the Democrats on the issue of Gaza in places like Michigan? Sure, I saw it anecdotally on the campaign trail. It was a real thing. Was it worth 10 million votes? I'm not sure about that. I don't think the data bears it out at all at this point, but we'll continue to study the exit polls and some of the data.
Great. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions.
And I'll hang around after.
Hi, my name is Diego Vargas. I'm a reporter for Fresnoland, a nonprofit based here in Fresno. I want to preface my question by saying that for a moment, the nation believed that Kamala Harris would have a stronger showing in Iowa after early poll numbers came out. Obviously, now we know how that went. My question to you is, how can reporters stay in touch with reality and talk to people in a political landscape that's increasingly wary of journalism and journalists?
I think they should all come to the Central Valley, right? Because this isn't Washington. I think the problem for so many people, you think about, I've joked with Bob Woodward about this. Before Watergate in 1972 to 1974, journalism for the most part in the United States was a working profession. People didn't need a college degree, and you just kind of got into journalism as a craft. And you covered the town council, you covered local sports, you covered the state, and it was a fun job for people who might be college educated, might not, and it was a community-oriented job, and it had you were integrated into the community. After Watergate and the release of All the President's Men, the movie in 1976, journalism somehow becomes this magnet for people from these schools that normally wouldn't be producing journalists. And waves and waves of people become journalists in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that never maybe would have become lawyers or doctors or business people or teachers before that. Now they were becoming journalists. And so for journalism to prosper, I hope people are looking at your work at Fresnoland, and not that you would ever leave Fresno, maybe, but I would love to see people recruit from Fresno, because the best reporters I know come from publications like Fresnoland or the Bee, or outlets from places that aren't in New York, Washington, or LA. And they have a sense that the country is different than the conventional wisdom in the power centers. And I always think my experience at National Review, which I mentioned earlier, was so important for me, and also going to public school, high school in Philadelphia, where I went to a huge public school of 3,000, 4,000 students, because you learn the rhythms of a world that's not just about insiders in Washington or New York. And when you're here in the Central Valley, people are concerned about water. They're concerned about agriculture, trade, the economy, and it's not just who's up or down in a tip sheet. These are real issues, and they affect people's lives. Immigration is not just a kind of a DC debate. If you're an undocumented migrant and you're a student at Fresno State, this is very real. Or if you're a Fresno State leader, it's very real. So journalism, to stay grounded, I think it has to get out of DC more. And I'm lucky I can travel the country all the time. I'm blessed to be able to do that. But I think for journalism to connect with the country again, it has to be of the country, and recruit and draw people and as I said, give people seats at the table if they don't have the traditional background.
Thank you.
Let's take one more.
I'm Vernon Crowder. I've been watching the changes with the Trump administration in 2016 into now. It's amazing to me the amount of derogatory misstatements, exaggerations, just some sensational things. so much that the media seems to have trouble covering it, but yet the public will tolerate it. Whereas many things that are said, at least in the past, if they've been said once by one politician, it could be the end of their career. What has changed in the public's appetite for this kind of discussion?
It's a deep question. The Democrats in recent weeks, and when they were closing the campaign, what did we see Vice President Harris do? She appeared with Congresswoman Cheney on the campaign trail. Why did she bring Cheney on the trail? Because they were focusing on Trump's character and conduct. But I could have predicted, candidly, that might not have worked, because I spent 7 weeks sitting in the court behind Trump in New York City. And let me hope for all of you, you never end up in New York criminal court. You know, growing up, I watched Law and Order. You ever see Law and Order? Everyone's good looking. It seems cool. Well, that's not how it is. It's dirty. It's cold. It's mean. Not a lot of good looking people. And when I was covering that trial, sir, there were no protests outside, pro-Trump or anti-Trump, which struck me. There was a criminal trial of a major presidential candidate, a former president, and it kind of just floated along. The country wasn't that interested. The pro-Trump people, maybe 10 people would show up every other day, go, pro-Trump, yay. And sometimes a few anti-Trump people would be there lonely with a couple signs. And I said to my colleagues, I said, what's going on here? No one's paying attention to this. And what I discussed with members of the press, and I don't know if this is the right answer, but I'm just trying to answer your question particularly. The erosion of local press in the United States has led to a disengagement with a lot of these issues. And it's led to kind of a surface level mass culture, but it's not the mass culture we had 15, 20, 25 years ago. Does anyone at your workplace even talk about the Academy Awards anymore? Probably not. Do they talk about the Emmys? Do they talk about sports? Maybe Fresno State Bulldogs to a point. But people don't talk about politics, sports, music, Hollywood in the way they did 10, 15, 20 years ago, because everyone's now living in their own social media algorithm and not part of a water cooler mass culture conversation. And that leads people to be less inclined to feel like they need to weigh in or even be informed about what's happening at the mass culture level. But they are peripherally aware of it because politics now seems to all be national, and people are paying little attention, unfortunately, to local politics in some respects. And to your point, you wonder why people don't seem to care about issues that used to be explosive and controversial even 8, 9, 10 years ago and now seem to just be nothing. It's a lot of it, I think, has to do with the pandemic, the way the media functions today. It's a longer, deeper conversation. But the country has changed and is changing about how it perceives character, conduct, and what the threshold is for acceptable behavior in public life. And there is an illusion among some public figures that the rules of the past are still the rules of the present, but they keep being bewildered when they see that people don't care about certain things like they used to. And maybe they never cared in the eyes of some. That maybe it was just kind of a creation, a belief, a sensibility that was out there that was never really there. And, you know, my friend John Meacham, the historian, he wrote the book, The Soul of America. And it's a great reminder in that book, this country's been through 1,000 rough periods beyond the Civil War, where we've had a lot of things that have been unseemly happen. And the country kind of carries on, embodies it. We had civil rights and violence and racism not that long ago. We had the internment of the Japanese affected so many people in this region and state. And so this idea that the country is perfect or is somehow going to be appalled, it's a rough country, but it's a beautiful country. And there's no place better than Fresno. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, Blake. Appreciate it.